Good morning. I have to catch my breath here. There's some stairs I had to climb. I should quit smoking, but it's really great to be here, and thanks to Ben for inviting me. I do a lot of these events, and I get to travel all over. I meet interesting people. I've never done an event for, electric market forecasters, but I think what I do in the mountains as well is I tend to do some forecasting, and I'll talk about that, how I think about what I do. And I've absolutely loved what I do. That's why I've been doing it for so long. I've been climbing now for 40 years. And the last 30 of those years, once I had enough training and experience, I started to go into the higher mountains of the world, the peaks over 8,000 meters, which is 26,000 feet. And I call that the big leagues. And the reason I like what I do, you got to like what you do it for that long. I like it because it's hard. That's in a nutshell. I like things that are hard, that take a lot of planning, preparation, training, fortitude, and that's what climbing big mountains is all about. A lot of these expeditions last for 3 months. From the time I leave my house until the time I get home, I'm gone for 3 months. But prior to that, I spend 6, 8, 9 months getting ready for an expedition. There's a lot of planning that goes into these trips. You got to get the permits, you put the team together, all the logistics, accumulating the equipment, the food, all of those things, the training, the physical preparation, the mental games that we play to get ready psychologically for these events. And when you go on a climb, there's no guarantee of an outcome. You try your best, you hope that you have done your homework so that when you actually take the test, you can perform it at your best level. But the higher you go, the harder it gets in these mountains. It gets steeper, it gets colder, the air gets thinner, and I feel like in many ways the mountains try to prevent you from succeeding. They are tenacious, they are relentless. They're just doing what they do, but that's how it is. And because of that, you need to be tenacious and relentless as well. Success is not measured in leaps or bounds in the mountains. It's day by day, it's step by step, and then it becomes breath by breath. And in some instances you move forward, and some days you have to hold fast, and a lot of times you're forced to go all the way back down to the bottom. And I kind of like that, the journey and the process. I like getting to the summit, but I like the whole process as well. I think when you read about a lot of the big expedition climbs, especially like Mount Everest or K2, you hear all the bad things that happen. The deaths, the injuries, the accidents, and people often think that's what I seek. They think I'm a risk seeker. In fact, what I call myself is a risk manager. When I go into the mountains, I understand there's different types of danger. There's the objective danger, and then there's another type which I call subjective. Obviously, the objective risk is ever present. It's the avalanches and storms and rockfall and icefall, the things that we have to accept and can't ignore, and that can certainly injure us or kill us. But in my opinion, the majority of risk in the mountain is subjective. It's decision making. It's how you do what you do and when you do it. And you can imagine a lot of people, when they go on these expeditions, it's a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for many of them. They spend a lot of time, a huge amount of money is invested. And so for a lot of those people, it's summiting at all costs. They have to succeed no matter what. And in the end, a lot of times that kills people. And I love climbing, but I like being alive a little bit more. So my whole attitude for a climb was it had to be a round trip. Getting to the summit was always optional. Getting down was mandatory. And I think, I was successful in what I did. It might have taken longer. So patience was the key as well. Knowing when to temper your ambition, knowing when to turn around in the face of risk. So about 10 years ago, after doing all of my climbs and my projects, somebody suggested that I write a book. And I'd never ever planned on writing a book. But I thought, why not share my stories, share what I learned, the lessons, and thankfully from all of my expeditions I had journals. So we had a wealth of information and details, which I love to talk about. I want to take the reader with me in this book and talk about what I did and also how and why. And for me, the title was very important, and I thought for me this was perfect. When you talk about climbing or doing a good job or creating a product, you don't want to take a shortcut just for the sake of getting it out the door or being successful. And in the mountains, there's no shortcuts. You can't buy your way to the top. You can't cheat your way. You've got to earn it. You've got to suffer for it and pay a price, and then you have success. And pretty proud about the book. It's done very well. But I do have friends that said I would have sold way more had I titled it Shortcuts to the Top. It was actually a book that inspired me to start climbing. I read this book. It was printed in 1950. And at the time when I read this, I was in high school, growing up in the great mountaineering state of Illinois. And this is a story about 8 French climbers as a team that went to this mountain called Annapurna. Now, Annapurna is one of only 14 peaks over 8,000 meters, roughly 26,000 feet. And as Ben said, these are all in the Himalaya, Pakistan, Nepal, or Tibet. And when this team went to Annapurna, none of the other 8,000 meter peaks had yet been climbed, not even Mount Everest. So if they could pull this off, this would be a big deal. And they spent 3 months together, this team of 8, and worked hard, trial and tribulation, a lot of toil and a lot of struggle. But through great leadership and teamwork, in the end, they put 2 of their team on the summit. Not everybody goes to the summit on these small expeditions. You sign up for this project, you go as a team, you work together, and in the end, maybe only 1 or 2 of you are going to go to the top and plant the flag. And that's, very altruistic. That's, in essence, what teamwork is all about. And I was so enamored by that story, the adventure, climbing a mountain, going with a group, the struggle, the ultimate victory. That flipped a switch within me. And I thought to myself, that's what I want to do. Someday down the road, I want to go to Annapurna, or I want to go to Everest. I want to climb one of those big mountains. So I had this dream. And I knew that wasn't going to happen overnight. I knew there was a lot of steps I had to take, a lot of people to meet, experience to gain. 10 years or so, I thought, before I could even consider that. So I knew what the process would be. And I knew that the first step I had to take was to get the hell out of Illinois, right? So I graduated high school. I moved to Seattle. And the reason being is I'd read about so many great American climbers that went to the Himalaya that got their start in the Pacific Northwest, because it is a great playground for climbing. We have the Cascades, we've got the Olympics, we've got Mount Rainier, which you can see 2 hours from downtown. This is this 14,400 foot peak. And I also, had a dream to be a veterinarian. So I went 4 years to the University of Washington, got a degree in zoology, and then I went 4 more years to Washington State and got a degree in veterinary medicine. And that was hard in and of itself. But during that time, I climbed voraciously. That's the reason I moved to the Northwest. And I did a lot of my training and experience gaining on this mountain. This is Mount Rainier. This is our iconic Pacific Northwest peak, 14,400 feet high. So it had all those elements of a Himalayan peak that I wanted to learn about. It was high altitude, it was cold, glaciated, the weather sucks, all the things and experiences that I could gain on this mountain, which became my classroom, I could take with me, I thought, as a stepping stone to higher and higher mountains. So I was able to learn by doing and listening and watching, and I climbed every weekend, and I climbed all summer whenever I had time. And I eventually learned enough that 3 or 4 years into that climbing career, I applied for and got a job as a guide on Mount Rainier, for Rainier Mountaineering, and that was in 1982. And I climbed and worked there for 10 summers in a row and made 215 ascents of Mount Rainier and 215 descents of Mount Rainier. So you got to learn about how to go up and how to go down, right? And the beauty for me was I thought, here I am guiding every summer, and I'm a newbie. I'm an apprentice, you might say. And in fact, lovingly, we were called peons. But there were senior guides above us with 10 or 15 more years experience. And I thought, these are the guys I can learn from. They're already going to the Himalaya. And maybe if I keep my mouth shut and do my job right, they'll invite me eventually to go with them. So I had a plan in place. And as a guide, we learn a lot about how to be safe, because we have customers that come to us. And our primary goal is to keep them alive. That's goal number one. And to be safe. And we rope together. We connect with ropes as a team, 4 or 5 or 6 people. We're stronger as a roped team, and we're safer as well. And we as guides, we have to constantly be making decisions and have what I call situational awareness, always evaluating not only the conditions around us and what might happen in 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 hours, but how's my client doing as well? Is he having a struggle? Is he having a physical problem? Do I need to coach him a little more? Is he a liability versus an asset? And that thinking and that constant wondering about what could potentially happen was, for me, perfect. And even when I went into the bigger mountains, these were great lessons for me to learn. And in spite of the fact that our customers are paying a lot of money to be here, they have high expectations to go to the summit. They bought brand new gear at REI. Doesn't mean we always get to go to the top. Ultimately, the mountain decides whether or not we get to the summit or not. We have to listen to the mountain. That's what I call it. The conditions, the wind, the snow, what's that cloud over there doing? Not thinking in the moment, but predicting what could possibly happen in the future. And because of that listening to the mountain, I knew how to temper my ambition, how to take everything in and then make a decision based on what's going on around me versus what I wanted to do. And that to me was one of the biggest lessons of my career. And I started to guide all over the world. I got invited by these senior guides to go to South America. I went to Alaska as an assistant. I got to go to Europe. I went to Russia. And I climbed higher and higher. And eventually I started to thought, I'm gaining enough experience. Maybe climbing Everest was possible in the future. It was legitimately a possibility. And so I try to learn about the history of these mountains that I plan to climb. I want to know their personality. What's the best season? Where's it located? How do I get a permit? What's gone right for people and what have people done wrong? And Everest has an amazing history. It was first attempted by the British, led by the famous George Mallory in the 1920s. And he led 3 separate expeditions, 1921, 22, and again in 24. And you have to kind of remember in the 20s, when they left England, they took a boat to India, took a train to Sikkim, and then trekked through the northern part of Tibet to get to Everest. Their round trip was about 6 months. And this is what they wore to climb Everest in the 1920s. I mean, this is what you wear to church today, right? They didn't have mountaineering specific clothing. And I think George, he was committed to climbing Everest. But by the time he made his 3rd attempt in 1924, I think his commitment became an obsession. He was obsessed with climbing Everest. And when he left on that 3rd and final trip, he actually told his wife, "I might not come home." I don't think that's a good idea to tell your wife you might not come home, because you've already set yourself up. And he and his partner disappeared high on Everest late in May of 1924. They died trying to climb Everest. The first successful ascent was not done until 30 years later. This is Edmund Hillary and Tenzing Norgay. They were the first 2 people to climb Everest. And there were 40 people involved in this British expedition in 1953. And out of those 40 people, 2 of them got to the top. Once again, there's that ingredient of teamwork. Everybody works together. 2 people plant the flag, cross the finish line, shoot the puck into the net. Same kind of idea. So that teamwork was a key ingredient. The second key ingredient, in my opinion, was the use of supplemental oxygen. And I think because Hillary and Norgay used it for the first ascent, it kind of became the standard or the norm for climbing Everest. This is 29,000 feet, 1/3 the amount of oxygen as there is at sea level. You need some sort of help or aid to get you to the summit. And in essence, the use of oxygen ultimately brings the mountain down by about 7,000 feet. And again, most people when they go to Everest, they don't really care how they climb it. They just want to say they climbed it. And so oxygen is kind of a legitimate thing to use. I started to think about how I wanted to climb Everest rather than just if. And to me, I thought, first of all, I don't want to look like this when I'm climbing Everest, but also I thought, the use of oxygen was kind of a contrived way of gaining success because you're really bringing the mountain down to you. And I thought, if I'm going to climb a mountain that's 29,000 feet high or try to climb it, I want to try to climb it at its level, not to bring it to mine. And so my idea and my personal rule was not to use supplemental oxygen. I didn't know if I could climb to 29,000 feet without, but I said, this is the only way I'm going to try to do it. I thought it was more in purity of style. I thought I would, obviously it would be harder, but if I could achieve it, the reward would be greater. So basically, that's why I did it. Secondarily, it'd be a lot cheaper. I wouldn't have to buy the oxygen, ship it over there. It simplified things. So 10 years into my career, I learned enough, gained enough experience, met enough people that I was finally in 1987 invited to go on a Himalayan expedition, and that would be to try to climb Mount Everest. This was a dream come true. And I was one of 8 people on this team, so relatively small. We didn't have any Sherpa support, so the 8 of us are going to do all the work, all the labor. And this expedition, from once we reach base camp, is going to take another 8 or 10 weeks. And here's how the logistics of this work. Base camp of Everest is at 18,000 feet. And it takes 2 weeks of walking with your loads, with porters, with yaks, with whatever, just to get to base camp. And this is then where we set up our base of operations. And we're going to live and operate out of this base camp now for the next 2.5 months, the 8 of us. And so imagine all the equipment that you have to have brought with you, and the food, and the ropes, and the anchors, and the tents. All the logistics have to be well thought out even before leaving the U.S. Because if you forgot something, there's no 7-Eleven around the corner. You could fail for lack of preparation. From base camp, then, we're going to start climbing the mountain. We can't go all the way to the summit in one day. It's too far. And eventually, it's going to take 5 days of climbing to get to the summit from base camp. But before we can think about that, we have to set up 4 higher camps that are above base camp, typically within a day's climb of each other. So the bulk of the expedition is us carrying loads of equipment to these various camps. The tents, the food, the fuel, the sleeping bags, the ropes, the anchors. All that stuff has to find its way up to these camps, and the way it gets there is on our backs. We become the trucks sending the supplies up the mountain. And we have to work as a coordinated team. If there's only 8 of us and if one person isn't doing their job, it affects the team tremendously. 1 out of 8 is a big deal. So I promised myself and the team, I'm going to pull my weight. I'm going to do my job. And from base camp to camp 1, which is 2,000 feet higher and a day's climb away, I could typically carry 40, 50, maybe 60 pounds of equipment. And we climb to camp 1. We do it over and over, day after day, up and down, back and forth for about 10 days until we finally have enough supplies at camp 1 where we set up the tents and we move a couple of guys into these tents, and then they start carrying loads to camp 2. And as 2 or 3 guys are up high carrying loads, you've got to have 2 or 3 guys below supplying them, right? It's like a military operation. You got to feed the front line. So this supply chain of product is being sent up very logistically and in a very timely manner. But as we go higher, we go to camp 3, drop a load, we go all the way back down to base camp, rest for a few days, then we climb back up to camp 3, and then we start carrying loads from there to camp 4. So we're up and down, back and forth. And that also then allows us to slowly acclimatize and build more red blood cells. But higher we go, the lack of oxygen means that we can do less work. So that supply chain starts to trickle. And by the time we're carrying loads to camp 4, 27,000 feet, it's all we can do to carry 15 pounds each versus 60. So that supply chain trickles. Camp 4 ends up being one tent with just enough supplies for 2 people. That's how it works out. Physically impossible to make a bigger camp with that small of a team. So we've done the work. We put in the infrastructure, we've carried the loads, we're acclimatized. We're now ready to try to go to the summit. But again, Camp 4 only allows for 2 people to occupy that final camp. Those are the 2 people that are going to represent the team and hopefully go to the summit. How do you pick those 2 people? We come down to base camp, we have a team meeting, leader looks around the tent and says, who wants to go to the summit? Nobody raises their hand, because by now you've been sick, you've lost 20 pounds, the motivation that you had in the bar 6 months ago is gone, you just want to go home. And a lot of expeditions fail because of lack of motivation in the end. They just fizzle out because the hardest day is yet to come. I was one of the 2 people selected, and the selection is based on who's still strong, who's still motivated, and also who's contributed, right, during that event. And what an honor for me and this other guy to represent the team, to plant the flag, hopefully. But there's a lot of expectation on success, right? This investment of time and energy and money is now on our shoulders. So we leave base camp, we climb through the first 4 camps, and on the morning of the 5th day, this is summit day, we climb out of the tent, 27,000 feet, 30 below zero, and it's midnight. We know it's going to take 12 hours from this high camp just to get to the summit and 6 hours to get back. So we leave wearing headlamps knowing we got to get back down before it gets dark. That's how you plan these climbs. So we start climbing 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 hours into that day. And you have to think about this. With every step that we take now, it has a consequence. Every decision has a consequence. Each step takes us one step further from rescue. You can't fly a helicopter this high. And if somebody's going to help you, if you injure yourself or do something wrong, it's going to take them 4 days to climb up to you. So imagine how you have to think about what you're doing at these altitudes. 10 hours into that day, we get to here, we're at 28,700 feet, 300 feet below the summit of Everest. Things went well up until now, and I thought, man, we're going to get to the summit. How cool is that? But the weather started to change very rapidly. A storm was brewing, and we started to have to think not in the moment, but in the future. What's going to happen? It's going to take 2 more hours to get to the summit. What's going to happen in 2 hours? Let alone what's going to happen on the way down. And we based on this imminent storm, based on that risk, that we should turn around. Because if we went to the summit, yeah, we'd succeed, but we would die on the way down. And that to me was a very obvious decision. We listened to the mountain, but we turned around 300 feet from the top. Imagine doing that. Imagine what a lot of other people do in that situation. Once in a lifetime, a lot of time, a lot of money, a lot of investment, a lot of expectation, right? You don't want to go home and say, oh, I failed to climb Mount Everest. I don't look at that as a failure. Failure is when you haven't planned and you haven't prepared, when you haven't done your very best. But if you're prevented from success based on something beyond your control, it's not a failure. I just call it a non-success. So I make it a little bit more positive. And I always thought, you know what, that mountain's going to be there a long, long time. And if I have to go back, I will. And I did. I knew the game that I was playing. So I went back to Everest the next year, tried again, had another non-success based on terrible avalanche conditions. So there's 2 strikes against me on Everest. And I was like, that's okay. I'm going to wait for the right moment. But in the interim, my 3rd expedition, I went to this mountain called Kanchenjunga, 3rd highest peak, only 800 feet lower than Everest, but in many ways harder to climb. Everest is the highest, but it's not technically the hardest. This is a 3,000 foot sheet of ice that we had to climb on our way to the summit of Kanchenjunga. And 2.5 months into this climb, 3 of us got to the summit. This was a big deal for me. This was my first actual summit of an 8,000 meter peak. And here we are standing in this little island in the sky at roughly cruising altitude of a jet. So when you're flying home tomorrow night or the next day, when the jet reaches cruising altitude, look out the window and imagine two guys out there waving at you. That's where we're hanging out. And from the top, then we get an amazing view. This is looking 80 miles to the west. Just left of center, you can see Mount Everest. And it's a great view. And if the weather's nice and if we're early, we can spend about an hour on the summit. If conditions are bad or if we're late, maybe 2 or 3 minutes. Because the whole idea is now that we've only done half the climb. People tend to celebrate on the summit, right? Because they've achieved their goal. I don't celebrate on the summit because I know I've only done the first half of the climb. The most important half for me is coming down, right? It doesn't count unless you get to the bottom. And a lot of people lose sight of that. They use all of their energy, resources, daylight, and oxygen just to go to the top. And they think coming down, it's a no-brainer. But that's when most accidents and deaths occur on the way down, because people don't plan for it. They don't budget for the round trip. And that's a big mistake in the mountains. So we made the round trip. I'd climbed Kanchenjunga. The next year, I had a third chance to go back to Everest. We climbed via the left-hand skyline. We spent 10 weeks carrying loads, acclimatizing, and on May 10th, this was now 1990, I had another opportunity to try to go once again to the summit. It was the perfect day. The hard part was I was alone on this day. Nobody was with me, and just the way the logistics worked out. So for 12 hours on my ascent, I was alone, which was kind of cool and interesting, and I could handle the technical parts without being roped up. But the challenge was, there's nobody to break trail with. There's nobody to set a pace or make decisions with. So all of this was within me, but it was very interesting. And you can imagine as you climb higher, 27, 28, 29,000 feet, I went slower and slower. And literally for every step I took, I would breathe 15 times. And I'd take another step and breathe 15 times. And imagine that's all you do for 12 hours. I mean, to go the length of this room could take a half an hour. So you have to be very patient. And I mean, you're struggling and you're suffering and you got snot frozen on your face and nobody really cares what you're doing. And you're trying to think about all these excuses to quit. It's too hard, it was too long, it was too cold, I didn't wanna. Those are all legitimate. Quitting's easy. And I was so tempted, but I said, no, don't quit. It's a perfect day. Keep plugging along. And success finally came. And I was then 12 hours into that day on the summit of Everest, one of the highlights of my life. So there I was all alone on the top of the world, which is very unique, very cool. But I thought to myself as well, not so cool, who's going to take my picture, right? So I have an ice axe with me, and I planted in the snow vertically, and on top of that, I balanced my camera, and I set the timer, and this was not a digital camera. We didn't have digital in those days. We had film. So I had to set the aperture, and I had to set the focal length, and then pray to God when that timer went off, I was in the right place, and the photo turned out, and didn't know till 2 months later when I had the film developed that my selfie actually turned out. And that's how you did it in those days. That was the hard part. And this is the view then from the top of the world, literally looking down on every other mountain on earth. Very unique. And I thought to myself, memorize this view, because you're not gonna come up here again. You're gonna go down, live a normal life, become a veterinarian. Remember this moment. Little did I know I would eventually climb Everest 6 more times. I had to go the second time. I left my wallet up there. But I do have other legitimate reasons for returning. So what next? I was always trying to look for how do I take what I've learned and experience I've gained and elevate myself to something even harder. My next idea was to try to climb this mountain. This is K2. We call it the Holy Grail. It is the hardest mountain in the world to climb by many people's opinion. And in 1992, I felt ready to try this thing. I mean, it is steep. The weather is unrelenting. It is the full meal deal. And nobody had successfully climbed it for 7 years, although 35 teams had tried. That's how hard this thing is. And I felt ready to try it. And I went there with a friend of mine. This is Scott Fisher from Seattle. We lived close to each other as neighbors. He was running a fledgling guide service called Mountain Madness. And believe it or not, at that point, I was no longer practicing as a veterinarian. And you can imagine why. I was gone 3 or 4 months of the year. So I eventually got fired, right? I'm not a good employee. So I made the choice, okay, veterinary career is not working, mountain climbing might. But I was living in a basement working as a carpenter, trying to figure out how do I support myself as a climber. We scraped the money together. We went to Pakistan. That's where K2 is. We joined a group of climbers, and then we did battle with this mountain. And you literally are doing battle. I'd done my homework. I knew how long it would take. I knew how hard it would be. I knew all the things that could go wrong, which I'd read about. And in fact, they did happen when we were there. So for me, there was no surprise. We had storm after storm after storm. We fixed rope on steep terrain, so it allowed us to not only ascend the rope repeatedly, but in the event of a storm, we could escape very, very quickly down this string of fixed ropes. We try to safeguard ourselves. And we went up and down over and over, back and forth, time after time. And about 2 months into all of this, most of the team started to give up and go home. And their reason was it was too long and it was too hard. So they hadn't prepared themselves physically or mentally for the challenge. A few of us stayed, and eventually Scott and myself were able to establish our high camp 4 at 26,000 feet. And there's no flat spots to camp on K2. It's so steep. You got to chop a ledge into the slope the size of one of these tables and put this little nylon envelope called a tent on top of it. And very unique to climbing, we like to make things lighter, and a way to do that is you make them smaller. This tent weighs 5 pounds. It's about the size of a single bed, and you got to get 2 guys crammed into here. So it's not comfortable, but it gives you protection for the night. And then the next day, we're hoping to climb that final 2,000 feet to the summit. And as you can see, the higher you go, the steeper it gets. So this mountain gets harder as you go higher. It is relentless. Therefore, you need to be relentless as well. So that tomorrow, that summit day, is going to be huge. I mean, that's our Super Bowl. That's our gold medal day. But we're not in the Four Seasons Hotel getting a massage with a buffet table waiting for us. The 2 of us are crammed in this little tent. One of us is sitting by this little stove, little pot, melting snow for hour after hour to fill our water bottles so that we can stay hydrated and take those bottles with us to the summit the following day. Believe it or not, at these altitudes, you have no appetite. The altitude creates a problem. You don't even feel like eating, so you eat like birds, but you're expending tremendous amounts of energy. So this is where you lose a lot of weight at the very end. We have high expectations to go to the summit the next day, but we woke up to this. A storm had come in during the night. 3 feet of snow had fallen, and we had to get up hourly, one of us going outside, shoveling the tent off to prevent it from collapsing. So obviously not a good day to try to go to the summit. Not safe, no way. And we started to think, what should we do? Well, we could have gone down, we could have escaped, but we thought if we went down, there's no way we were going to be able to get back up. It was going to be too hard. So we decided to stay and wait. Scott and I in this little tent. And we stayed together in this tent for 3 days. I mean, this is where you really have to like who you're with, right? Because somebody's not going to survive if you don't. And what do you do for 3 days? We didn't carry books up there, too heavy, no iPad, no iPod. I'd been with Scott for 3 months. There's nothing left to talk about. And you just sit there and you contemplate what's going to happen. Will we be allowed to go to the summit? Will we still be strong enough? And you think after laying around for 3 days, you're going to be stronger than 3 days ago. But in fact, you're not. You're actually slowly withering away. You're dying up there because of lack of oxygen. That's why it's called the death zone. And people said, there's no way you can stay up there for 1 or 2 or 3 extra days. And we thought, you know what? If you're up there, it's mind over matter. If you don't mind, it doesn't matter. And that's what our attitude was. And our patience paid off. That window of opportunity came, the weather cleared, and we were then allowed to go to the summit of K2. And it took us 10 hours from high camp eventually to climb and then stand on the top of this mountain. So our patience paid off. We were willing to be uncomfortable. I have this saying that you've got to be comfortable being uncomfortable. And that helps create success. If you're willing to suffer a little bit, you can succeed at almost anything. And we climbed K2, and I looked at that and I thought, wow, I'm at this level. I love what I'm doing. I'm gaining more experience. I'm still learning, but I'm working my way through these high mountains. And I looked at my resume and I thought, wow, I've now climbed the 3 highest mountains on Earth: Everest, K2, Kanchenjunga. And I hadn't really planned on that. It was invitations, it was opportunities. And I thought to myself, now I want to keep doing this because I really like it. But I want to have a plan. And what's my plan? I thought, why not go out and climb all 14 of these 8,000 meter peaks? Only 2 or 3 people on Earth had done it. What a great challenge. And I thought to myself, I've done 3, there's only 11 left. And I didn't care how long it would take, 10 years, 15 years, 20 years. I didn't put a time limit on this. And I call that leaving things open-ended. I think if you restrict yourself at a certain time limit and you can't achieve something, you're like, well, I'm out of time. But if you let yourself have the time, you can do amazing things. Even when I go on these expeditions, I don't even buy a return plane ticket. Because I've been on climbs when people have a return ticket, they're running out of time and they say, I have to go home because my plane ticket says I have to go home. They go home, we stay, and we get to the top. So I leave things open-ended. So I had this plan, this goal, I call it Endeavor 8000. And I thought to myself now, great, but how do I pay for all of these expeditions? Multiple years of expeditions. And I had an idea. I was already working with a lot of outdoor companies, equipment manufacturers, a few tech companies. They were giving me free product. I had a garage full of free stuff. I could have opened an outdoor shop. And I went to them and I said, listen, I love your stuff. It keeps me safe, makes me successful, but I need cash. You have to actually pay me now to use your stuff. But in return, I'll give you a return on your investment. I will help you create a better product. I will design, develop, I'll go to trade shows, I'll go to marketing meetings, I'll do whatever you want, but you're gonna pay me now. And excuse me, and that's then how I created this portfolio of companies that supported me. And because the money, obviously comes from typically the marketing department, you end up looking like a race car driver, right? You got the logos and the caps and the flags. And that's the thing. That's how I then created these relationships. And these companies then came along with me for the ride. And I have multiple of these companies that I worked with for years and years and years. And with that support then, I was able to go do what I did. The next thing I had to do was find the perfect teammates, partners to do these climbs with. And then I started to think, okay, I've been on trips with 6 people, 8 people, 10 people. It's easier all around because everybody's contributing, hopefully pulling their weight. But it's harder too. There's conflict, right? There's stress, there's personalities that you don't want to be with, and it's more cumbersome and more expensive. Why not just climb with one person? 2 people as a team. How do you find that perfect partner? First of all, I thought I got to like you, because if I don't like you at sea level, I'm not going to like you at 26,000 feet. And trust. We implicitly have to trust each other. We're roped together. We're connected. And if I don't trust your skill sets, and if you don't trust my skill sets in this dangerous arena, we shouldn't be together, let alone be roped up together. And in 1995, I found what I thought was that perfect partner. It was like going on multiple dates until I found that right person. This is my climbing partner, Veikka Gustafsson from Finland. We met each other, we climbed together. He climbed without oxygen. He wanted to do the 8,000 meter peaks. I liked him and I trusted him. And the other benefit was that he could pay for half of everything. He was a superstar in Finland. He was the first Finn to climb Everest. And in a country of 5 million people, that was a big deal. He had his own action figure. So he had a good income. And off we went. He and I climbed together then as a 2-person team for the next 10 years. And we had great adventures, multiple climbs we did together. And we had a really good batting average. For every 3 trips we went on, 2 of them were successful. And in my world, that's pretty good. It's typically 1 out of 4. 2 out of 3 was really good. Everything would go right. Nothing would go wrong. Boom, safe and sound on the summit. And in fact, during my entire career, which I'm so proud about, I never had an accident, never had frostbite, and more importantly, never lost a climbing partner. And in my world, that's very rare, and that's kind of unheard of. I mean, imagine, when you get on the plane with 6 people, you go do something like climb a mountain, and on the way home, there's an empty seat on the plane. I never wanted to experience that. I'm so glad I didn't. And, we'd come home from these safe, boring successes, and the media, they weren't really interested. And I'd say, well, why not? And they'd say, well, nothing happened. They were so used to some sacrifice or price that was paid for the sake of success. And I said, no, it doesn't have to be that way. On a third of these climbs, though, we'd go halfway around the world. This is a mountain in Pakistan called Broad Peak. Spend 2 months on this thing only to be stopped 100 feet from the summit based on dangerous avalanche conditions. And at this point in my career, I was experienced, I was a professional, I had a lot of expectation other than my own. I had sponsors, the media was following me, other pressures that could trickle in and change how you make your decisions. And I promised myself not to break those rules for the sake of others. Listen to my instinct, listen to the mountain. We're already on what I call that razor's edge in the mountains between safety and tragedy. And if you start breaking your rules, if you start thinking about taking a shortcut, you could fall into that trap of complacency. In my world, people, I've seen it, they get comfortable with their risk. They've done something over and over, by the book, safe and sound, day after day, time after time. And it's that one thing, one day, they go, you know what? I'm going to break my rule because I want to get to the top, or I want to get home sooner, or I want to do it faster. And a lot of those guys that I knew that started to do that, they aren't around today. I had to remember my foundation and remember I was doing this for me and not for anybody else. And I think that keeps you on track. And again, I knew patience paid off. I would go back, and in fact, I went back to Broad Peak 3 years later and climbed 99% of that mountain again so that I could climb that last 100 feet. So I always knew I could go back. I had things that allowed me to keep things open-ended. In 1996, I was then halfway through my project. I'd climbed 7 of the 14 peaks, but I kept going on multiple expeditions to Everest. And I was invited to go on my 8th trip in 96. And I was always like, okay, why do I want to go back? This was a very interesting event that I was invited to be part of. We would be filming ourselves as we climbed the mountain. And the head photographer, director, filmmaker was David Viesturs. He was a mountaineer, climbed Everest a couple of times, and then he became a filmmaker, high-altitude filmmaker. And he invited me to come along. My job was to run the expedition, to do the day-to-day logistics so that he could focus on the directing and the filming. And the most challenging part of this trip was to get a 40-pound IMAX camera all the way to the summit. This is what people heard about and said, man, that's going to be impossible. You can't schlep a 40-pound piece of metal to the summit of Everest. It can't be done. And I think if you don't want to try something, impossible is a really great excuse. We looked at and we said, man, this might be possible. Let's do this. And I said, sign me up. I want to see if we can't do this. This is going to be hard, but it's going to be very interesting. So off we go, and we started to think about, okay, we're going to have a lot of extra equipment, a lot of extra people. The team has to be very carefully selected. And traditionally, when you go to Everest, even since Hillary's day, when you have a big team and you want to get a big amount of gear up the mountain, whether you're guiding, whether you're filming, you need some extra support. And we typically hire the local Sherpa that live in the higher elevations of Nepal. They're genetically adapted to altitude. And since they've been kids, they've had something on their back. Because their trade means carrying a sack of potatoes from my village to the next village and carrying a bag of salt back to my village. Or I've got a brother or sister on my back. So it's no different for them to be on Everest with a load on their back, and they're getting paid to do that. And they do get paid well, they get bonuses, and we treat them as equals. They're part of our team. But in many ways, they're kind of the unsung heroes of Everest. A lot of people don't want to admit that these guys did all the work, and that's what happens today on Everest. You hire these guys, they do all the work, and you get to go to the summit. And they do deserve credit, And I think any organization, any business has Sherpa quietly in the background doing all the little day-to-day stuff, helping you to succeed. And you need to thank them for their contribution. And they helped us climb the mountain. We arrived at Everest Base Camp. This is the spring of 1996. And if you've read the book Into Thin Air by John Krakauer, this was all about now to happen. There were 15 teams at base camp, well over 350 people, and kind of the floodgates had opened. Previous years, the Nepal government restricted the number of permits that they would sell, 1 or 2 per season. So I was used to going to Everest as the only team, very quiet, all alone. Here there's 15 teams. The government realized they could make a lot of money selling permits. And also guiding was in its infancy and was developing, commercially led expeditions with clients, experienced clients, amateur but experienced. And 2 of the larger guided expeditions were led by 2 of my good friends, Scott Fisher on the right, who I'd climbed K2 with, and also my good friend from New Zealand, Rob Hall, on your left. I'd actually worked with Rob as an assistant guide on 2 previous Everest expeditions. So I knew both of these guys very well. And I could see something was different this year. There was a lot of pressure for them to succeed. And that pressure then starts to change how they made their mountaineering decisions. Each of them had 8 clients. Each client pays $50,000 to go. So there's that financial pressure. And you want to succeed this year with your team because then people sign up with you to go next year. They both had journalists with them writing about the outcome. So you want to make sure you have an outcome that's good so that the story is good, which increases your business, right? And now we've got 2 competitors on the mountain at the same time watching each other, playing off each other. One guy goes, the other guy's going to go. It was kind of this thing, and I could see something happening. So we look at the route. We're going to climb the normal route, the Hillary route. We're going to see each other every day. It becomes a community of climbers. We have loads to carry. We have ropes to fix. And the first part of the climb from base camp to Camp 1 through the Khumbu icefall is notoriously the most dangerous. The glacier is sliding down the mountain like a river of ice, 4 feet per day roughly, creating blocks of ice, sometimes the size of this building, that are slowly shifting, moving, teetering, and toppling. And very unique to Everest is we have to negotiate pathway through here, and we bring ladders. We rope them together. We build bridges with these ladders. We tie them together with rope. We have safety lines, obviously. And we have to be innovative as well. It's like Cirque du Soleil, in the icefall. And if there's a big obstacle, we build a big ladder. This is 9 ladders that we tied together to get up and over this wall of ice. Not OSHA approved either. So you've got to just be innovative and figure out how to get through this maze. Oh, and by the way, we are also not only doing what everybody else is doing, we're filming ourselves as we do this. So multiple times each day, we have to stop, set up the tripod, set up the camera, do our scene, pack it all up, and then keep going. And knowing that we had a schedule to keep, but more to do each day, meant that we got up earlier and we stayed up later. And in fact, we did fit everything in. And we, as other teams, were right on schedule. So the schedule means, here's what happens on Everest. You typically go in the spring when it's getting warmer as you're climbing, and May tends to be the best window of weather for hoping to go to the summit. The winds die, the jet stream moves off the summit. There's clear, calm weather typically in May. So you spend all of March and April on the mountain early, carrying loads, building camps, and acclimatizing. so that by May 1st, you're all back down at base camp and you wait for what you think or predict or guess might be that perfect day to go to the summit. In 1996, we didn't have great weather reports, and we kind of guessed on when the weather was going to be nice. We looked at our barometers, we kind of hedged our bets, what traditionally was a good day. And here's what happens very commonly at base camp. And this was what Rob Hall was kind of the most experienced leader at base camp, the most successful, the most looked up to. And he traditionally had success on May 10th. And I'd been with him on Everest before. May 10th was a good day for him. So he decides, we're going to go, our team's going to try for the summit on May 10th. So that means they've got to leave base camp on May 5th, right? It takes 5 days. He makes this announcement. All the other teams and leaders hear about that decision. And what do you think they decide to do? They're going to go on May 10th as well, because Rob's going on May 10th. That happens year after year after year after year, and the crowds build. We call it summit fever. Nobody wants to wait for day 2 or day 3. They're all afraid that they're going to miss the boat. So in fact, 40 people joined forces. Rob Hall, Scott Fisher, 2 other teams. They're all going to climb to the summit together on May 10th. And you think, wow, safety in numbers, right? Everybody's going together. I'm going to go with them, go with the group, grow with the herd. We heard about this and we thought, no, it wouldn't be safe. We were more nimble, more agile as a smaller team. And we decided we would try to go to the summit on May 9th. This would be a day ahead of the crowds. So we make this plan. We're here on the morning of May 8th. This is Camp 3. That day we plan to go to Camp 4 and the following day to the summit. So we're 2 days away now from finishing this project. Pretty exciting. But we looked up and we kind of were thinking, man, the weather isn't good enough yet. It's still windy up high. The jet stream is still parked on the summit. You can hear it screaming. The clouds came in every day. Storms were still brewing. We thought, we have a date in the calendar, but we need to be flexible. And in fact, when I have a calendar on these expeditions, I use a pencil because I have to erase my plans and move things around. I never use a pen. So you got to be flexible. And our instinct was telling us not to go up. Conditions could be better. Let's wait. We decided to go down, not giving up, but going down and waiting. And as we went down, we crossed our friends, these other teams going up. And imagine the conversations. They're going, why are you guys going down? We're like, I don't know. It doesn't feel right. It could be better. We didn't have a legitimate reason other than our instinct was telling us it could be better. So as we're going down, they're happily going on their way up. And you start to think, who's making the right call? And you're tempted then, when a bigger group or a larger team is going in the other direction, you're tempted to doubt yourself. And we had to listen to ourselves and say, we as a team, we've made a choice, we're going to live with our choice. We went down, they went up. May 10th, they started early enough, but they climbed far too slow. The large number of people, rather than being on the summit within 12 hours, which is what they needed to have enough oxygen to come down, it took some of them 16 hours to reach the summit. They weren't willing to turn around. They needed to succeed. And I think because Rob kept pushing along, Scott kept pushing along, and vice versa. And I also think that the younger guides that were hired to work with Rob and Scott didn't feel empowered to question their leader's judgment. So they weren't willing to raise their hand and say, should we take a time out and make a choice about what to do? They kept going and going. They were already building what I call this house of cards. And then a storm hit the mountain and it killed 8 people. 2 of them were my good friends, Rob Hall and Scott Fisher. They were trapped high on the mountain. It became the largest mountaineering history ever. We were down below. We raced up the mountain and help people, survivors, come down. We gave away oxygen and we evacuated the survivors from the mountain. But sadly, the people that died up high, we couldn't retrieve their bodies. It was too challenging, it was too dangerous, and they're still up there today, sadly. And we had a memorial service then for those that died at base camp. And a lot of the teams that were there packed up and went home. And you can imagine why. This was sad, this was scary, this was tragic. But we as a team, David and I, thought we need to make our decision about what we want to do. And I already had started to think what I wanted to do, and I thought I wanted to go back up. I wanted to turn that season into something more positive. And I felt that we as a team, we could regroup. We still had time, energy. Let's go back up and finish this. And we as a team unanimously made the decision to go back up and make one more safe attempt. And we waited for 2 more weeks. And then we had beautiful weather on our way to the summit. This was an actual piece of footage from the IMAX film that was released a year later, titled Everest. It became the largest grossing IMAX film in history. And as you can see, spectacular day, just a few feet below the summit. I got to the top. It was my 4th time on the top. I felt proud of that. I felt proud that I had done my job for my team. But I was most excited to finally see the damn camera on the summit, right? That was our goal. That was our mission. And in spite of how hard we knew it was going to be, I mean, there was so many things that were thrown into our path that could have stopped us, that could have prevented us, but we kept going because we had a common goal as a team. And we weren't overwhelmed by the immensity of the project, which could have easily happened. You know, we broke it down into segments and into days and into steps. And even though some days you're pushed back, you regroup and you go forward again. You have that longer term vision, and that's how we climb these big mountains. And I think that's how we succeeded in getting the camera to the top. After that event, you know, I kept thinking, wow, I've still got a lot of mountains to climb, and I could have been tempted to quit. A lot of people thought, look what happened on Everest. It's going to happen to you. And I said, no, I'm still kind of abiding by my rules. I'm still just as conservative now as I was when I began. Something could happen, but I still think I'm going to make good choices. And I kept going, kept climbing, did 6 more of these 8,000ers over the next 8 years. And by the end of 2004, then I had climbed 13 of the 14. I had 1 mountain left. And that 1 mountain left is Annapurna. Remember that book that I read about as a kid? This is Annapurna. I'd already actually tried Annapurna twice before. I hadn't left it for the end, but I tried it twice before. Turns out this is the most dangerous of the 8,000ers. Based on its architecture, it's got avalanches that shower down all of its faces. It's like playing Russian roulette. You can be the best climber in the world and not be able to control the risk. And only 180 people had climbed Annapurna. 60 had died trying. So the odds were not good. And my first 2 trips to Annapurna with my partner, we walked away, said, nope, off the charts, too dangerous, scared to death. And I started to think, should I try Annapurna again? Is it worth it? You know, I thought if I die on Annapurna, that's not going to look good on the resume. But I also thought, you know, maybe I could let it go. Be good, be happy with 13 out of 14. But I'm one of these guys where, you know, I got to keep trying, So I thought, I'm going to try for the 3rd time and go to it and at least confront it face to face. And it'll tell me what to do. But I won't know unless I go. So I made the choice to make a 3rd trip. And I didn't do that lightly or easily. By then I was married for 10 years. And this is my wife, Paula. We had 2 kids. And so I had a lot more to think about. But believe it or not, my wife allowed me to do what I did. She never once told me no. She always believed in me. She always trusted me. You know, it wasn't like we met and got married and then I said, oh, by the way, I'm a mountain climber. You know, she knew that. And to have somebody like that supports what you do when you leave the house, man, that lightens your load and it helps you to be successful. And I'm so thankful that she allowed me to do what I did. And so off we go, Veka and I. This is our 3rd time on Annapurna. What's going to happen? We don't know. And people kind of thought I was going to throw caution to the wind. They told me later, they said, we think you're going to break your rules when you go. And I said, no, I'm going to listen to it just like I've listened to it before. We spent a week at base camp watching the mountain. And believe it or not, conditions were absolutely phenomenal. It was colder. The mountain was glued together. There was no avalanche activity. We were kind of at the right place at the right time. The conditions were great and perfect. And so off we go. And we were then, climbing under stuff that normally could have peeled off the face and broken and avalanched, and it didn't. And, we had the skill sets to overcome all the obstacles that we needed. It wasn't an easy climb, but we were then a well-oiled machine. We helped each other. We safeguarded each other. We motivated each other. And in the end, on May 12th, together, we took those final steps. And then I sat on the summit of Annapurna with my partner, Veka. This was now the end of my 18-year project. I now had climbed all 14 of these peaks. It was, for me, a dream come true. But imagine something that takes 18 years. You don't really know how long it's going to take, but eventually it does. How do you stay motivated? A lot of things could have prevented me from success. Lack of motivation. I could have run out of money, support, enthusiasm. I could have died. Somehow I pulled it off. And to me, it was a great moment. But the greatest moment was when we finally got to the bottom of Annapurna. I didn't let myself be too excited on the summit because we had to get down. And when I got down, I thought, wow, why was Annapurna at the end? And it kind of had to be. I needed 30 years of experience to succeed and survive on Annapurna. So it came at the right time of my career, and it was perfect. And then somehow poetically, this story, this book that put me on this path ends with Annapurna. So my life comes full circle. So I'll leave you now with the last sentence of this really great book. I think it's a great book on leadership and teamwork, perseverance and patience. And pictured here on the cover, this is the summit of Annapurna, 1950. The leader, Maurice Herzog, was one of the two to climb to the top. And he's also the author of the book. But you can see he's flying his flag, and to do all that, he took his gloves off. And he lay them in the snow, and then he watched them slide into the abyss. And because of that, and he didn't have a backup pair of gloves, and he froze his hands. And on the 4-day descent, froze him to the point where all of his fingers had to be amputated. He'd frozen his toes on the way to the top, had his toes amputated. And he even says in the book, he said, Annapurna changed his life. And he was willing to pay that price for the sake of victory. It's a huge price to pay. I was never willing to pay that price. But that book that he wrote changed my life. Obviously, it flipped the switch. It put me on this path. And also because of that book, I always carried an extra pair of gloves, right? But the last sentence of his book is he says, we all have our own Annapurna. I think that's a great metaphor for life or for business. The horizon of your career is a series of mountains. You get to a certain level this year, you've achieved a goal, you're happy, you're satisfied, you're going to go, wow, we went to another level. But then there's that expectation of next year, right, to grow, to make more, to grow your business, to go to a higher level. And why not? That's what makes life interesting and exciting, and that's what grows business. So you make that commitment to say, okay, I'm going to go further next year. I knew what it takes to get to a certain level. I kind of think I'm ready to go to that next level. So you put one foot in front of the other, and day by day, some days you're going to move, some days you're not going to go anywhere, some days you're going to go backwards. But it's that long-term goal, that open-ended part of it where you just say, I'll be done when I'm done, and I'm going to keep going and keep pushing. And you surround yourself with a team, right? Your coworkers, your partners, your family, your friends, they're part of your team. The Sherpa in your business, the people in the background doing all the things that help you. That's all about that partnership. And there's planning, there's preparation, there's perseverance. I think the number one key to success in any business, I know this from climbing big mountains, is passion. If you love what you do, it doesn't matter how long it takes. It doesn't matter how hard it is. Because if you embrace the journey and if you like the process, that's the biggest part of how you become successful. And I think with all those ingredients, you guys as well will climb your Annapurna as well. Thank you. I think we're going to do some questions, right?
Yeah, we've got a few minutes.
Yeah, right on.
Yeah. Okay, thank you so much. We've got a few questions here that we'll pose to Ed. How have you handled it when your team hasn't worked well together on a climb?
Yeah, that's hard. You know, I've been on some expeditions where there's actually been fistfights, there's been chairs that are flying, and typically then it's up to the leadership of the team to decide what's going to happen. And quite often, you know, we've kicked people off and said, you're out of here, you're going home. And, you know, there's obviously some conflict going on. So rather than leave that fly in the ointment, let it simmer and brew, you've got to kind of cut the cord. And that's a tough thing to do, right? But that's what happens. And you can imagine a team of 6 or 8 or 10 people day after day in a really stressful environment, a lot of egos, a lot of decisions that people don't believe in. Things happen. And that's why I always thought when I trimmed it down to this partner, we knew each other, we never had a conflict, and I got rid of all that anxiety doing that.
Thanks. A couple more. One is, do you still climb, and when is your next climb?
I still climb, but not at this high level. I mean, obviously when I finished this, I thought, okay, I'm good. I don't need to be tempted to try to outdo myself. You know, I think in athletics, it's best to go out on top. You see a lot of athletes that kind of keep going and going when they should have just kind of left. And in my world, if you stay around too long at this high level, things can happen. I went back to Everest. Annapurna was 2005. I went back to Everest again for the 11th time in 2009. And I thought, okay, that's enough. 11 times on Everest is good. But I still climb smaller mountains. I live in Idaho now, so I do some guiding there. And I still do some guiding on Mount Rainier. Yeah.
Fantastic. Let's give one more warm welcome to Thank you.
Thanks, man. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you.